morning. Welcome to the Institute of Land Warfare Army Profession of Arms panel. This panel will be conducted from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Then we'll take a short break to allow folks to leave, and media will stay behind for a Q&A period. Anyone is welcome to stay for that session as well. If you have a chance after this panel, downstairs on the exhibit floor at both the headquarters TRADOC display and at the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic display is more information about the Army Profession of Arms and the Army campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, here this morning to introduce the panel is the President of AUSA, General Retired Gordon Sullivan. Sir.
Thanks a lot. Welcome, folks. I'm sure there'll be some people drift on in. So let me get started. I'm going to introduce General Caslen, but before I do that, I have a couple of thoughts about the subject at hand. I had occasion to speak at the TRADOC Senior Leaders Conference out in Kansas City here, I don't know, a month or so ago. And ever since then, kind of sharpened up my thoughts on the issue of the Army as a profession. And I reflected on my 30-some years of active duty. And I'd like to just make a couple of comments about that and comment on the time, this window that we have, and try to relate my experience. And by the way, there's other people here on the panel as old as me, who maybe even older for all I know, who experienced the same thing. I was commissioned in 1959 as a reserve second lieutenant from Norwich University. I came in the Army as what was known as an OBV2, an obligated volunteer for 2 years. I quickly decided that I would try to compete to be a regular Army officer, and did, but that's not the important point. The interesting thing about the Army in those days is that if you talked about professionalism, you actually had a divisive structural force. Many of the senior non-commissioned officers in the outfit I went to a tank battalion at Fort Hood, Texas, had been officers during the Korean War. And they were master sergeants and sergeant first classes because they wanted to finish their 20 years and retire. Frankly, they were a difficult audience to get to because they had been reverted from officer status back to NCO status and were not particularly happy about it, and they were just doing their time to get out. Obviously, we had the non-commissioned officers who were looked upon by the troops, who were all draftees, as lifers. That was a very demanding and difficult environment for non-commissioned officers, regular Army non-commissioned officers, to talk with draftees about being a professional. So we had these camps in the Army, and that continued through to 1973. And then, of course, there was the active Army, regular Army, lifers, the Feds, who were viewed as the Feds by the Guard, and, of course, the reserves. So we had multiple fragmented bodies out there. And to talk about professionalism with this group was always a challenge. Today, because of what has happened the last 9 years, I believe we have an opportunity to bridge the gap which has always been there. For the first time in my career, in my life in the Army now, which is over 50 years, in or around it, the active Guard and Reserve are closer together than we have ever been. over 50% of the Guard is wearing combat patches on their right shoulders. They feel as if they have done a good job, and I believe the active Army people feel the same way. This is not an inconsequential change. Shame on us. Shame on us if we can't take advantage of this and move forward to elevate the performance of the leaders of the United States Army writ large in a cohesive, unified way. I think what you will hear from this panel is the beginning of a very important dialogue. I know General Casey will talk about this at lunch. He actually talked about, at the congressional breakfast this morning, the relationship of the reserve components, the Guard and Reserve, with the active Army going forward, so that the Guard and Reserve is viewed as an operational force and an operational part of the Army. That is much different than relegating the Guard and Reserve to what is known as the Strategic Reserve. Okay, now your panel chief today is Lieutenant General Bob Caslen, who's the commanding general of CAC, the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, a distinguished soldier, combat veteran leader of note in many ways. First of all, graduated from West Point. That's not the important thing. They actually thought enough about him as a graduate to bring him back as the Commandant of Cadets, which ought to tell you something about him. He had service as Chief of Staff of the 101st, Chief of Staff of the 10th Mountain. He got that right, and they gave him the 25th Infantry Division at Schofield Barracks. And he took that division to war and became the commanding general of multinational Division North up in the northern part of Iraq. He's a great soldier. He's got a lot of practical experience, practical leader, and he knows how to cut through the fog and get to the nub of the issue. So let me introduce him to you and present him to you. I urge you to become involved in this dialogue. It's hard to get dialogues going in the Army. I think this is an important issue, this whole business of professionalizing the force and getting us focused on the future, which is very uncertain, and you cannot achieve what this country will want us to achieve without having a completely dedicated and cohesive force with strong ethical orientation and mission accomplished orientation. So, Bob, it's yours. Thanks a lot to all of you for coming. We appreciate it.
All right. Working. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, General Sullivan, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. The fact that you took time out of your busy schedule here with all that's going on says a lot about not only you personally, but what you feel about this campaign that we're about to do on the profession. So, sir, thank you. There is no better example of professionalism than General Sullivan in your lifelong career of service. Thank you, sir. As General Sullivan said, my name is Lieutenant General Bob Caslen, the commander of the Combined Arms Center. And what is very fortunate for the Combined Arms Center is that we have this organization called the Center for Army Leadership. And it's in the Center for Army Leadership that we have the responsibility to be the proponent for the Army for leadership development. So as we were looking at the profession of arms and the professional military ethic as an Army and where all that should be placed, when General Casey became the Chief of Staff of the Army, he created the Center for the Professional Military Ethic, which was at the United States Military Academy. And just recently, the Army decided to shift that over, to keep it at West Point, but to shift it over an organization so they would be aligned with leadership, because there is not a sliver of difference between leadership development and the ethics and the ethic of the profession of arms. So we're very glad that the Center for the Professional Ethic is aligned with us. And as we're going to introduce to you today, the principal duty that we have with this profession of arms in this center is to have this campaign of learning about what the profession of arms is over the next year. The folks that really help us at CAC in this Center for Army Leadership are Brigadier General Sean McFarland. I know Sean's in here someplace, and he's got oversight of all of this, doing a great job. And off to my left is Colonel Sean Hanna, who is the director for the Center for the Army Profession Ethic. And he's going to be the moderator for this panel, and I'll introduce him here in a few minutes. I'd also want to thank all of you for attending. I'm not exactly sure why you were here, but I have to assume that you care about your Army, whether you are in the Army or have been in the Army at some particular point, or whether you're a citizen of our country whom the Army serves. I know you care deeply about your Army, so we're very glad that you're here. This gives us a tremendous opportunity to talk a little bit about the profession of arms at large, but it also talks about the campaign that we're going to have over the next year or so. I don't have the honor to introduce the panel. Sean does, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank all of the panel members. We have a phenomenal group of officers and leaders up here that know the profession by the fact that they have lived it, they are living it, and they are intellects about it. And you'll be very pleased, I think, with some of the discussion that comes from all of our panel members. My role today is the principal speaker, and what I really want to do is I want to show you an introductory video that we have for about 4 or 5 minutes. And following that, I want to show you what this campaign to study the profession of arms is really all about. What it's going to look like, what the timeline is, what are the key lines of effort in this campaign of learning. And that'll take just a few minutes after that. And so I'll show you the video, and then we'll explain to you the campaign of learning, and then I'll introduce Sean Hanna, and Sean will introduce each one of the panel members. So again, thank you very much for coming. Dave, let's see if we can go ahead and roll the video, please. I appreciate it.
The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Thomas Jefferson. After more than 230 years of selfless service to the nation, our profession of arms is rich in strong traditions and values, highly skilled, powerfully motivated, and totally committed. There is no type of human endeavor where it is so important that the leader understands all phases of his job as that of the profession of arms. Major General James C. Fry. Discussions or reflections about the profession of arms begin with an understanding of what a profession is and how we meet that definition. The Army is an American profession of arms, a vocation comprised of experts certified in the ethical application of land combat power, serving under civilian authority, entrusted to defend the Constitution and the rights and interests of the American people.
The Army is a profession because of the expert work that it produces and the fact that the people within the Army develop themselves to be professionals. They're not just time servers, they're not government bureaucrats. These are people who are motivated intrinsically with a desire to serve the Republic, to defend the Republic, and it's expert work.
The world in which we operate as a profession has changed. After almost a decade of persistent conflict with an all-volunteer force and with organizational transformation and adaptations underway since 2001, it's time to take stock.
It's imperative now, not just a good idea, it's imperative that we examine our profession and ensure that we've got the right emphasis in place to maintain our standing as a profession and to build character.
My responsibility, our responsibility as lucky Americans, is to try to give back to this country as much as it has given us. General Colin L. Powell. As a profession of arms, the Army is unique in that we serve only one client, the American people and its civilian authorities. The Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon. George Washington.
Our support for our constitutional way of government, for civilian supremacy over the military, is something that spans and remains the same through all changes in doctrine, all changes in how warfare is fought. It is a constant that is part of our sacred duty as members of the United States Army.
I am a soldier. I fight where I am told, and I win where I fight. General George S. Patton. Unlike any other profession, we have been entrusted by our client, the American people, to apply lethal force, ethically and only when necessary, across a full spectrum of operations, including offense, defense, and stability or civil support operations.
That foundation of lethality brings with it incredible obligations and responsibilities. And I think it's in understanding those responsibilities that we find the ethic, that we find the ultimate requirement for character.
As a profession of arms, we are guided by well-known Army values, creeds, and oaths of service, hallowed words and beliefs.
They've been part of our culture really for the last 235 years. Specifically, when you look at the soldier's creed, it really defines who we are as soldiers and who we are as leaders, and what our roles and responsibilities are to our soldiers and our organizations where we serve.
Living up to our Army core values and ethos is what our leadership expects, it's what our allies expect, and indeed it's what the American public expects, those that we serve.
Numbers alone do not produce military strength. Soldier quality is essential to our strength. This duality is achieved by good leadership and instruction. General Maxwell D. Taylor. Maintaining and fostering our high standards of professionalism is the job of every Army leader.
I think the leader's responsibility is to preserve that which defines us as a profession. Expert knowledge, a commitment to continuing education, a certain set of values.
Our purpose, our clients' expectations, our culture and ethic, these are just a few of the elements involved in answering the question, what does it mean for the Army to be a profession of arms?
Okay, thanks. What I'd like to do is, if I can get the slides up there, just kind of walk you through what this campaign of learning for this profession of arms is going to be about for the next year and then plus, and just kind of give you a background on that. And then again, when I get done talking, we'll pass it down to each one of the panel members, and then you can hear from each panel member for about 5 or 10 minutes each. And in the end, we want to have a dialogue. We really encourage to have a dialogue with all of you, so that be thinking of a question over the next, while each one of us are talking, and on some issue with regard to this, question on your mind or whatever, either about the campaign itself or about the profession of arms. These are the people that really are living it, and as I said, have the intellectual capacity to understand and describe what a profession is. So this is a great time to have that discussion. So we want to leave some time in the end to be able to do that. In the next slide, if I could please, this is the chief's intent for the profession of arms. I know you all had a copy of the AUSA Green Book, and in that Green Book is the chief's article. And right at the end of the chief's article, he actually, let me just read to you what he puts in there about the intent of this thing. He said, I believe it's time to examine the impact of the last 9 years of war on our profession, the profession of arms. The effects of war have changed us as individuals, as professionals, and as a profession in ways that we don't yet fully appreciate. For us to succeed as an Army in the second decade of this century and of this war, it is imperative that we gain a better understanding of how a decade of war has affected us, both personally and professionally. And then he goes on to say, to this end, I have directed General Martin Dempsey and TRADOC to conduct a study and to lead a dialogue over the next year on the impacts of a decade of war on our profession. to inform our views on what it means to be a professional soldier in the area of persistent conflict. So that gives you an idea there. So as you see, what General Casey wants to do is he first wants to assess, and then he wants to go ahead and have the discussion and the dialogue. And you'll see as we talk about our plan and the campaign plan, that's kind of how we have put it together. If I could have the next slide. You know, some people may ask, well, why this campaign and why now? And that's a very good question, and I hope to try to answer that for you right here. There actually have been a number of studies on the profession of arms over the years. Many of them were officer-centric. One of the more famous studies is in 1970 when the Chief of Staff in the Army, Westmoreland, went ahead and had done a study there. But it was really, that particular study was in reaction to a problem that was occurring within the officer corps at the end of Vietnam. And General Casey would be eager to say that our study today is not because of a problem to address a problem. Our study today is to understand what our profession is. We have a tremendous opportunity with this all-volunteer Army to understand this profession, and then as another outcome to prevent a problem. I would just say that as you hear the panel members today on the profession and what it means, you're going to hear a lot of positive reasons about what has occurred over this war in the last 9 years and what the positive reasons, how they affect our profession. Then you're going to hear some of the other, what General Dempsey calls weak signals about our profession of arms. Some of the unintended consequences that have occurred over the last 9 years. Some of us that have been in the Army for a number of years, my own personal example is coming in to become my platoon leader in 1976, and I took an infantry platoon in the 9th Infantry Division way back when that had just come back from Vietnam about a couple years earlier. And in that platoon, there were only 2 non-commissioned officers. One was an E7 and one was an E5. And the E7 lasted all of about 90 days, and he was arrested for statutory rape of a 6-year-old boy, court-martialed and sent off. And so he was replaced by the only other non-commissioned officer corps, or non-commissioned officer in my platoon who was an E5. I didn't even have NCOs to be squad leaders, so I had to make them acting corporals because I didn't even have the authority to make them corporals. We made them acting corporals. And that was the extent of the non-commissioned officer corps that I personally experienced at the end of Vietnam. And that most historians would say that the Vietnam War was the last time our nation and our Army had fought a persistent conflict. Most historians would say about 10 years. And now if you fast forward 40 years to where we are today, now entering our 10th year into this war, just if you look at the example of the non-commissioned officer corps today, where we are in the 10th war of this persistent conflict, and you look at the competence of the non-commissioned officer corps, you look at the strength of the non-commissioned officer corps, you look at the ranks, you look at the professionalism of them, and you look at their performance over the last 9 years, there is a difference, and most people would agree with that. There's a significant difference, and you got to say, what has made the difference over 40 years? Because that very positive product that we see today in the non-commissioned officer corps influences, impacts us, and there's something that we can learn from that within the profession of arms. I would also say there's, as I had mentioned, some other weak signals, and if you just stop and think for a second about some of the weak signals, I'll just mention a couple of them. Way back in 2003 and 4, we had Abu Ghraib, where we had the degradation of leadership at the junior level, and the consequences that we saw as a result of that. Haditha, another example of that. And then another weak signal I would say you could throw out there is the fact that today we're doing investigations of officers' performance in combat as a result of combat deaths to the point where their classification is dereliction of duty. I'm not commenting whether that's right or not right, but the fact that we are and the consequences of that, what does that mean for us as a profession? And then if you looked at the early bird discussion, not last week, the week before, there was a lot of discussion about the role of the Department of Defense, and we in the Army in the department with regard to our relationship with our civil authorities. And what is the proper relationship between us and the military and our civil authorities? What's that relationship for policy? What's that relationship for for development of strategy and things like that? So those are all, I think, some of the things that are part of this profession I think that we need to talk about. So that's why this campaign and why now. We have 9 years of war. There's a lot of good things that happen, a lot of kind of weak signals that we ought to take a look at, and I think we're at this time with this all-volunteer force and what this force has been under for the last 9 years as we go into the next decade of persistent conflict to understand what our profession is, and then the product of this study is going to be to develop the DOTMO, the doctrine, the organization, the leader development of what really needs to take place in order to develop a professional force. Okay, if I can have the next slide, please. These are two key definitions that I want to provide for you for the profession of arms and the profession. The first definition is the profession of arms, and the second definition is the Army professional soldier. I don't want to read them to you, but let me just give you about 30 seconds or so to take a look at those, and I want to highlight a couple key phrases and words in each one of those definitions. Okay, if you look at the profession of arms, it says the Army is an American profession of arms. A vocation is comprised of experts certified in ethical application and serving under civil authority entrusted by the Constitution to defend the Constitution. What's interesting is that when we take our oath of office, we don't swear allegiance to the Commander-in-Chief, we don't swear allegiance to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we swear allegiance to the Constitution, to support and defend the Constitution. And it's in that Constitution that you find embedded in it the relationship between the civil and the military and the authority that exists between the two of them. And it's in that relationship that we in the United States military find us as servants in the subordinate relationship. And then it's through that, as servants, that the ultimate client whom we serve, because of this, what's stated in the Constitution, is the American people. It's a very interesting relationship, and but it's all embedded right there in the Constitution. So when we swear allegiance to the Constitution, it's in that allegiance that we find that particular relationship. And what's critically important, I think, is the fact that we are servants of the American people. And as a result of that, it's up to us, at least I believe, to develop that relationship, and that relationship's got to be a relationship built on trust. And that's critical in all of this when you talk about the profession. The professional soldier is another great example. Again, you see there the adjective of expert. The other thing I like in there is that it's in that definition, you're bonded with comrades of shared identity and a culture of sacrifice and a culture of service. And again, you see the words or the phrase in there, the highest ethical standards. So those are two of the definitions. I want to make one point there, that some of the products that you're seeing today in the beginning of this campaign are really elements of what we call a white paper. We have to throw something out there to have the discussion. What we want to have happen over the next year as we have this dialogue and this discussion is to talk about the ideas and the definitions in the white paper. This definition up here is really a draft. That's why we put draft up there. So that as we go through this year of discussion, at the end of the year, then we'll go back into these definitions, we'll go back into some of the other principles and really understand the way they should be based on the dialogue and the discussion that's going to take place over the next year. Okay, and the next slide is how the campaign is going to, I don't want to walk you through all the details in this, but really, as you look on the left there, we have 3 lines of effort. The first line of effort is to assess, to understand where our force is, and to survey and ask the tough questions. I know there's a risk of unintended consequences. You remember way back when, I forget what year it was, and they did a study at Fort Leavenworth with CGSC about the majors, and all of a sudden they took a survey and the thing got released, and all of a sudden we had this huge problem with the majors way back when. Well, lo and behold, those are some of the risks of unintended consequences, but we believe it's more important to have the discussion than to not have the discussion. So understanding those risks with the unintended consequences, we'll proceed. But the first one is to assess, and then to have the discussion and the dialogue. And then the third one, although it's right there at the end, is critically important, and that's to review and understand how all of what we have learned affects our doctrine, how it affects our organizations, how it affects our leader development, how it affects our training. And that's going to be our responsibility here in the Institution Army of Training and Doctrine Command to integrate all that. Look at the top. See, I had mentioned earlier that most of the studies on the profession of arms really dealt with the officer cohort. But you see on the top, you have the officer, the non-commissioned officer, the warrant officer, soldier, and civilian. So some good questions that we're going to ask ourselves: are civilians part of our profession of arms? Our Department of Army civilians part of our profession of arms? Our contractors? Our soldiers? What does it take to transition from apprenticeship into the profession? Is there a set of criteria? Should there be? These are all great questions, and this is some of the questions that we want to have in the dialogue. So we see all the 5 cohorts up there. Okay, next slide. Now this is a timeline, and onto the very top you see the 3 lines of effort in sequence. First is to assess, then to dialogue, and then to review and revise our doctrine and DOTML PF accordingly. I would also argue that they're not necessarily in sequence. While we're doing the assessment, there's going to be opportunities, and definitely you'll see some discussion and dialogue that will take place. If you look on the second bar going across, you see the 4th symbol in from the left is where we are today, and that's at AUSA. And the announcement of this, and actually there's a release of terms of reference and the release of the white paper. So those are the products that are coming out today. This panel is the official release to the United States Army and to the public at large about this campaign. And then there's a series of forums to have a discussion at senior levels in the Army of what has taken place in other forums and other discussions at more lower levels of echelon. And at the Army birthday in June, we want to really have a good discussion of what were our findings based on the assessment. And it's the Army birthday is going to kick off into this further dialogue that will take place, that will go through AUSA next year, and then right at the end of the year, we'll present the findings to the 4 Star Conference, along with not only those findings, but the recommendations for DOTML PF. Right on the bottom, you see that arrow, and that arrow is very important because we believe this is a bottom-up, not necessarily a top-down. General Casey told us, and this is important, and this is where I think I would ask for your help in thinking about some ideas of how we can get to where General Casey's guidance is, and that is, he says, I want this to be as informative and embraced, this study to be embraced by lower-level sergeants and lieutenants, as much as it will be by the intellectual level of the senior levels of our Army's leadership. So he's saying a young sergeant E5 and a young lieutenant, what kind of discussions so that they get involved and they have a desire to get involved and a desire to talk about this, and that it's not something that they just dismiss that the senior levels of our leadership, Army's leadership, is going to end up doing. The point being is that this discussion really needs to take place at all echelons in our Army and to really embrace all levels of the Army. So, and that's why you see the arrow as a bottom up, because those low-level discussions, the OPDs and the NCOPDs that will occur at the company and battalion level, and the ideas and discussions that go up through a series of forums all the way back up to those those critical forums that you see on that line. So that's kind of how the campaign will occur over the next year.